This is the beginning of a day when we will look back on events that happened 20 years ago, a long time. Much has passed, but for very many of us it was like almost yesterday. 20 years ago, that was Thursday, the 15th of August of 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev, President of the Soviet Union at the time, had just arrived in his official summer residence at Forus, close to Yalta in the Ukraine. The state of the Soviet Union was miserable in the extreme. The economy was in a deep state of collapse, and not only the three Baltic republics, but also Armenia and Georgia had already declared their independence. And in particular, since the autumn of 1990, tensions have been building up very considerably inside the regime itself. On the one side, you had what was referred to at the time as the so-called power ministries, centered around the all-encompassing security defense structures of the state. And on the other hand, the increasingly vocal President of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin, he'd been given a popular mandate, I think in June of that year, in some sort of semi-alliance with the different republics that were seeking either outright independence or a very far-reaching autonomy. On Friday the 16th, those who would become the conspirators met in the guest dacha of KGB in the southern outskirts of Moscow and decided to act. And on Monday, the 19th, in the morning, the world woke up to what was a reactionary putsch in Moscow, pursued by a rather desperate gang of 8, trying to turn the clock back and trying to fundamentally restore the old order. I belong to those and others here who very well remember that particular day. We saw on the television pictures the tanks rolling into the streets of Moscow, and we, in our small part of the world, we were in the middle of the beginning of an election campaign, the early phases of it, but suddenly everything, of course, came to a halt. In January of that year, we had seen the very same forces trying to regain full control of the Baltic republics by a combination of military might and political manipulation. And there was no doubt that that particular attempt then was the beginning of an attempt to take control in Moscow as well. But it failed in the periphery due to what happened in the Baltic states, and accordingly the attempt to do it in Moscow had to be delayed somewhat, but now we are obviously there. Today, we of course all know what happened during those fateful days in Moscow 2 decades ago. Late in the afternoon of that Monday, the newly elected President of the Russian Federation climbed up on one of the tanks that had gathered outside the White House in Moscow and read out his, must be said, extremely defiant and brave declaration. And 2 days later, the coup had failed. A result of the combination of the, I think has to be said, sheer incompetence of the plotters and the bravery of Boris Yeltsin, and a radically new reality had appeared. On August the 21st, the Russian Federation took the step of officially recognizing the independence of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. And 2 days later, it even banned the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The world had truly changed. It would take some time until what remained of the Soviet Union decided to abolish itself. But before it did that, it, on September the 6th, formally recognized the independence of the three Baltic states. And this is, of course, of some importance. Their independence was not only a result of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was recognized by the Soviet Union itself before it itself dissolved. Events in the Soviet Union during the years leading up to these dramatic days had, for rather obvious reasons, been followed with great attention here in Sweden. And more than most, we had developed links with the political forces that had emerged bravely, courageously in the three then Baltic republics. Our policy towards them had not been entirely uncomplicated. Along with others, we had naturally welcomed when they, along with Poland and along with Finland, were able to emerge as independent states after the twin collapses of the Russian and the German empires at the end of the First of the World Wars. And relations during the interwar years had been friendly and had been good, but without being particularly close. They were fragile states in an area where tensions were gradually building up again. Their fate was of course sealed, as we know, when Hitler and Stalin on August the 23rd of 1939 divided up the east of Europe between them. Hitler evacuated the German populations from primarily Estonia and Latvia, and in 1940 Stalin proceeded with the occupation and Sovietization of all three of them. This is not the place to go into the details of the drama of the tragic years that followed. In 1944, large numbers of refugees, primarily from Estonia, but also from Latvia and even some from Lithuania, were able to cross the Baltic Sea and find a future in Sweden. But Sweden also agreed to the Soviet demand to forcibly send persons that had fought against it back to an uncertain fate. During the dark decades that followed, a strange silence reigned in our country concerning these, our immediate neighbors. We could talk, and we did, rather loudly about colonialism, occupation, and imperialism in sometimes even faraway corners of the world, but there was an almost collective silence against the same in our very own part of the world. I don't believe that the governments of the day had any particular illusions about what was happening in the Soviet Union and its three Baltic republics during those years, but to talk about it was another question. These were decades of silence that we now remember with a certain shame. There were a few who tried to attract attention to what was happening. Let me mention just the name of Anders Küng, since he, since some years, is no longer with us. But they were often marginalized. To be anti-Soviet was not really acceptable in our political debate during those years. The more remarkable against this background was the surge in sympathy and support for Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania that we started to see when the old songs of freedom and independence started to challenge the Soviet flags on the other side of the Baltic Sea. The so-called Monday meetings will be remembered with the 18th meeting on Norrmalmstorg in a couple of hours. And the history of those meetings really reflect the history of the independence movements of the Baltic states. To Norrmalmstorg came its leaders and talked to the world when they were full of hope. But to Norrmalmstorg also came its leaders in the days of fear, where they afterwards retreated to discussions about the possibility of setting up exiled governments in Sweden. But independence did come, and it was the result of the combination of the united determination of their peoples, their peaceful and determined struggle, exemplified here by the presence of Madlar, and the heroism of the Democrats of Russia. We, those who spoke and those who were there and supported at Norrmalmstorg, were proud to be able to give the support that we could give. When independence was re-established, it was the end of one period and of course the beginning of another. And for Sweden, it was then a key task to help the three nations on the road to stability, security and European integration, to true independence and sovereignty. In retrospect, we of course know that all of this went very well. But during those years, it was by no means certain that that was going to be the case. Things could have gone as wrong here as they de facto did in other parts of Europe. The withdrawal, as we said at the time with the phrase, the early, orderly and complete withdrawal of very substantial and also very important ex-Soviet military forces and installations had to be negotiated carefully and had to be implemented carefully. And the very difficult question of the situation of all those from other parts of the Soviet Union that had been sent to these three republics without perhaps any will of themselves, in order to change their demography, had also to be handled in a democratic and responsible way. Their economies had to very quickly turn from a total Soviet dependence to something that could actually work, an orientation towards the West. And the three countries had to be put on a secure path to Atlantic and European integration. Our new neighbors were fortunate to have leaders of principle who, with the words of Václav Havel, dared to dream the seemingly impossible to make the seemingly impossible become true. They had the support of friends abroad, here in Stockholm, but also, of course, elsewhere. And crucially, we were fortunate that the early years of these efforts were years still dominated by those political forces in Russia that had recognized independence in August and September of 1991. But there were, of course, periods when we feared that this would change, in which there would have been a very real danger, and a very obvious danger, for the newly established and independent nations. They were still fragile. They were still not anchored in the institutions and the structures of the West. 2 decades later, the 3 Baltic states have performed far better than any other part of the former Soviet Union. And if we look at the last few years, in spite of the severity of their financial crisis of the last few years, they have become models of economic reform and also how to handle also very deep financial challenges. These very days, of course, if we look at the newspapers and follow the news, Europe is associated primarily with weaknesses and problems as states struggle with deficits and debts and whatever they. But today, when we look back at what happened 20 years ago, we should also somewhat broaden that perspective, and then we can see that the last 20 years in this part of the world and Europe has produced an immense success story. Media are reporting, I don't know what's true, that the famous rating agencies are contemplating to upgrade Estonia, a country that has recently joined the euro and knows virtually nothing about debts and deficits. And in the debates also on the other side of the Atlantic, I now see that Latvia is mentioned, that a country that, in spite of recession more severe than any other country in Europe, is seen as a model for how the most difficult issues can be handled. And they have, in all essence, retained, also during difficult times, a democratic majority and political stability that is the envy of man. There were few, if we look back, finally, on the 15th of August of 1991, that could have believed that Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania 20 years later would be where they are today. They clearly belong to the successful story of Europe, and we might even say to the particular success of the north of this particular Europe. Thank you.